And we'll go ahead and begin. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Watson, and welcome to our webinar this evening on lawn care. I am one of our agriculture agents with the UT Extension Washington County office. And tonight we are going to be focusing on lawn care. I'll mention up front that any trade or brand names that are mentioned this evening does not imply approval of those particular products or exclusion of similar products that aren't mentioned. It's just a way for us to communicate with each other more clearly. And with any pesticides that we may mention during the talk this evening, always be sure to read and follow all the label directions, regardless of what is said in this evening's talk. So tonight we are going to focus on cool season tall fescue lawn care. And the reason we're going to do that is, one, that's the dominant lawn that we have in our region, and for good reason. It's best adaptive to our environment. And so we are in a little bit of a transition zone. If you've lived here a while, or if you've looked at any number of different zone maps, you'll see that we're kind of in between. We're not really cold, we're not really warm. And so that does allow us to sometimes push the limits sometimes. And certainly we can have successful Bermuda lawns in our area. It has happened. But by and large, the turf type tall fescues are regarded as the best suited to our environment. So that's our focus tonight. And one thing I will mention, we don't recommend bluegrass as a lawn species for our region. Unfortunately, bluegrass just doesn't handle the temperatures or disease pressures that we have as well. So it's not the best choice for our region. And so quickly, this is one of the publications that you'll be receiving from me. Basically, there's another group of fescues besides tall fescues that could be a possibility for your lawn in our area. And that would be called the fine fescues. And there's actually sort of three subtypes: chewings, hard, and red. They're very comparable to tall fescues with the exception of one caveat, and that would be their tolerance of high temperature. And certainly we get high temperatures during our summers, and because of that, that kind of puts them a notch below tall fescues for that reason. However, there is one caveat to that. The fine fescues do very well comparatively in shade to the tall fescues. So if you have a lawn that has a lot of shade, and maybe you've struggled with grasses in the past, it may be that the fine fescues would be a better option, even given that trade-off of lesser high temperature tolerance. So that may be something that's important for your lawn, or even one part of your lawn. Other than that, the two are fairly similar. The fine fescues are physically a smaller plant. We would mow those at a lower height than we would tall fescue. In fact, sometimes we will see fine fescues in mixes that are intended for no-mow lawns, where people are not wanting to mow, or at least not mow frequently, because they are a lower growing species of fescue. But again, typically and predominantly in our area, we see tall fescues. I don't really have a short list of specific cultivars that I would recommend to you on the turf type tall fescues. And I will mention, we do want to look at the turf type tall fescues. So for instance, if you go into any ag store and probably a home improvement store as well, you almost certainly find Kentucky 31 fescue seed available. That is not a fescue that I'd recommend for your home lawn. We have much better options on the market today. The varieties out there, and you can look at variety trials where they may have 30 or 40 different varieties that are on the market, and there's almost no separation in the varieties. They all perform well. There's been a tremendous amount of research by the companies, especially in the area of disease resistance. And so any of the available varieties on the market, again, the turf type tall fescues, should do well in our area. I do like blends. So if I'm buying seed for my lawn, I would look at a blend. And it's just a mix of a couple of different types of those turf type tall fescues. I would look at the label and make sure that they're not putting in something else as well. Sometimes with some cheaper blends, you may see a ryegrass or something on there as a percentage of the mix. We don't want to see that. We only want to see either the tall fescue, if that's what we're going with, or the fine leaf fescue, if that's the option we want to look at. So just make sure it doesn't have others in there as fillers. And again, quality blends won't have that, and you should see 3 or 4 different varieties of the fescue you want to plant. Timing is important, and we'll reference back to this a few times. But basically what we're looking at is how we deal with cool season grasses. So as a cool season grass, the fescues basically see the greatest growth in the cooler weather. So that is in spring, as well as again in fall. And I know that may not make a tremendous amount of sense, because when we think about how often we have to cut our lawns in the summer and things like that, but when we look at both the shoot growth as well as the root growth, we find that those cooler periods are when they actually put on the greatest growth and do best. So summer is just kind of a lesser growth period for them, but certainly they do grow. But because of that, that's basically why we have the timing of the different activities we would do. And so we'll talk about some of these as we go through tonight. I will mention I did not specifically include irrigation. So certainly if you have questions related to that, we can speak to that at the end. And it's just by and large for every irrigated lawn that comes through the office with a question or concern, there'll be 100 non-irrigated that do. And so given the need to keep this within a allotted time, I'm not going into irrigation tonight. So one of the questions I think we have to ask whenever we start approaching our lawn is, how do we plan to use it, and how much do you enjoy mowing? And so certainly, for some people, the lawn is a very active location. It's used with them and their families, so it's not just a green space. For other folks, it is literally just that green spot. It's just something that complements the house, the landscaping. It's not something they're actively using on, their home or farm. The other question about how much do you enjoy mowing is not really a joke, because the more intensively we manage the lawn, so essentially the more we fertilize, the more we irrigate, the more that we are going to have to mow. And so just understand that the highest input side of the lawn is also going to have the highest work and labor requirement from us. And that may not be a problem for you. I have before spoken to a gentleman who was retired. He liked mowing his lawn 3 days a week. He did a tremendous amount of things with his lawn, and it did look excellent, but he certainly put the time in it. And if that's what you're wanting, just understand the direction that you're heading in. One thing that can be useful, and I think this is particularly useful if you have a lawn that's not performing the way you would like, is soil test. So what a soil test does is it just tells us our current levels of nutrients, as well as the pH at which our soil is. pH is important because if you're too acidic or too alkaline, so too low for acidic or too high on alkaline, what ends up happening is nutrients become less available, or if we go to extremes, they can actually become so available they become toxic. So there you see a graph, and all it's representing is when that blue bar for the individual nutrients, such as nitrogen at the top, as it narrows, that means that nutrient is less available for plants. As it widens, it's more available. And what you see that between 6 and 7, we pretty much have excellent wide availability of those nutrients there. And so what we find, as long as our soils are between 6 and 7, we're not going to try to modify the pH. We modify pH by applying lime to raise the pH to make it more alkaline, or we use elemental sulfur to lower the pH of a soil and make it more acidic. Typically, it's very unusual that we would have a lawn soil sample that actually needs pH adjustment. I don't think in the time I've been in this position that I've seen one that actually required it. Because again, 6 to 7 is a fairly common range for our soils natively. And so unless we have something maybe a little bit out of the ordinary, we're probably not going to make an adjustment there. But I will say with that, with the absence of a soil test, we're not going to give a recommendation out of our office to apply phosphorus or potassium, which is also called potash. So a lot of people know it as potash, or lime. Phosphorus particularly, we're concerned about water quality. So if you're aware of fertilizer leaching or runoff where it leaves the site we intend for it to be applied to, with freshwater water systems and ecosystems, phosphorus is actually a bigger concern than nitrogen. And so that's why we certainly don't want to over apply phosphorus to a situation where we may cause leaching or runoff of it into the aquatic environment. Potassium, again, if it's not needed, it's not going to help us to add additional to the soil. And lime, we're not going to try to guess that our pH is off or too acidic and that we need to apply some. We're only going to do that if we know for a fact it is. So that means basically we're left with applying nitrogen as maintenance for our lawn. And so with established lawns, there's basically 2 time periods we can apply the fertility, and it goes back to being cool season grasses. That's late summer into fall, as well as early in the spring. And so with our cool season grasses, you do have basically 3 levels of maintenance intensity, the highest being one that is irrigated. So basically we're providing additional fertility to it because of its ability to have irrigation during drier periods. But for low lawns, just for those that might want to, just kind of keep the lawn looking a little better, you can look at doing a couple of applications. So a ½ pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, both around March 15th and again in September, or you could look at pushing that a little bit later into October. Sometimes our Septembers are very hot and dry. If we have a very hot and dry September, the grass isn't going to do a lot of growing. And so that's one that sometimes we would pause, and instead of applying it in September, we'd apply it later into October. There's nothing wrong with that. We can see on the next line, the medium intensity would look at doing that ½ pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet in March, in September, and then a second application in October. So certainly delaying an application until October is not going to cause problems. And for those lawns with the highest intensity, we would look at possibly raising the nitrogen rate. Again, I think by and large, most lawns would not fall in this category, but you could possibly raise your nitrogen amount to 1 pound of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And you can look at applying it in March and again in April. But let me say, we never want to apply fertilizer after April 15th. The reason being, if we apply it after that date, we are risking having that fertility pushing growth into the warmer periods of summer. And whenever we force growth like that, we end up with more diseases. Brown spot particularly, we can almost be assured if we go and fertilize late April or into May, something like that, we can almost guarantee that we'll have brown spot problems in our fescue lawns. So make sure we're not fertilizing too late into April. In fact, that's why I wanted to get this into the rotation for these classes at this time, because there's still a few days. And again, if you happen to apply on the 16th, the world isn't going to end with your lawn, but certainly that middle of April is a deadline we want to try to meet. So if you haven't done any fertility this spring and you're really not satisfied with how your lawn's doing, you still have a few days to get that in. So just be aware of that. And we don't want to go late on that one. That's one we want to try to stick to middle of April. And certainly we can't even extend on those higher intensity lawns into November. I really think that, particularly those fall applications are important for our cool season grasses. A good bit of the nitrogen that we apply in March and perhaps in April, if we have a high intensity lawn, I feel really pushes a lot of growth into the summer period, and that just means more mowing for us. So if you asked Adam, how can I fertilize my lawn maybe to have the healthiest or the best ability to, survive summer droughts, I would say focus on those fall applications, because I think that that's a key in our area to having our grasses do well. And so just a quick note when we're talking about a half pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Depending on what product you're using to apply that nitrogen, you're going to use different amounts of that fertilizer. So for instance, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend, typically, again, if we're only doing nitrogen on the lawn, we're looking at utilizing a fertilizer that is only nitrogen. So something like urea or something other that may be offered by your local supplier. But let's say we were using a product, and we'll make one up, that's 10, 11, 12 on the bag. That first number, that 10, references 10% nitrogen. The 11 would reference 11% phosphorus, and the 12 would reference potassium or potash content. And so if we have 10% content in our fertilizer, and we're needing half a pound, we would apply 5 pounds of the fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. And so that's just how you do the quick math there. Certainly, if you're ever in a situation where you need some assistance with that, there's online calculators, and you're more than welcome to give me a call or send me an email. One thing that I think is important to talk about with these lawns is mowing height. And that may seem a little odd, but we'll talk about why that is. So here's straight from one of the publications that you'll be receiving in the resources: optimum mowing height for the various grasses that could possibly be grown across the state. Now, we'll reference that these publications do cover the entire state. So certainly there are species that would do excellent in Memphis, but do very poorly here, and vice versa. So you do have to understand that not everything is applicable to our region of the state. That being said, what we find is there's actually recommendation. We have cooler temperatures and more humid. We can actually cut the lawn a little bit shorter. And when it's a hotter, drier period, we want to actually increase the height that we're mowing. If you don't want to worry about, well, when do I move it up? When do I move it down? You can default to 3 inches. That's on the tall end of the cool and humid period, and it's not at the maximum on the hot and dry. And so we're certainly 3 inches you can utilize as a height, no matter what the climatic conditions are at the moment, and be safe. And we really like to cut at a higher height. You remember me mentioning that those fine fescues, the chewings, the creeping red, and the hard, and you can see there on your screen, are actually cut at lower heights. And again, it's just the nature of the plant, the size of the plant overall. But if we try to cut our tall fescues at that height, we don't have good luck with them. And so the taller we allow that tall fescue to grow, the more optimum growth we have. And so this is actually a demonstration that was from Oregon State University, but it would hold true in our region, and it would definitely apply to any number of grass species. This specific example, if I remember correctly, is actually bluegrass. But what we see is, depending on the height which we maintain the grass, or that mowing height, we get greater or lesser root growth. And so certainly you see there, the higher the height of that grass, the more root growth, the more root density we have. And so if we ask the question, which one of these is going to have the greatest survival during a drought period, it's going to be the one with the greatest root growth and depth. We can just see a dramatic difference. And so this general trend of the higher we allow them to grow within a range, the better off they are. And it just comes back to the simplicity of, where do these grasses make energy? It's in their leaf blade. And so when we allow longer, larger leaf blades to grow, they're producing more energy, and that energy is in part directed into root growth. And so that's why we see such a dramatic difference depending on the height that we maintain turf at. It is important, though, let's say we set our mowers at 3 inches and we're doing well, we don't want to let them get too tall before we cut them. We don't want to scalp your lawn. It's not unusual at all that I'm driving around in the county, and I will see lawns that are being cut entirely too low or they're removing a tremendous amount of material. Certainly, we've all been in the circumstance where we've let our lawn go too long in between mowings. It happens. It's not going to kill a plant, but if we do that frequently, we are just adding stressors to that plant. And when we stress plants, we make them more susceptible to diseases and insect attack, and we're just not going to get the growth and performance out of them. So typically, we hear the rule of 1/3 with lawn mowing, and basically it says we should never remove more than 1/3 of the plant or the length of the leaf blade whenever we mow. So a very easy calculation to do for us is whatever our mowing height is, times that by 1.5 or 1.5, and that will give us the maximum height we can allow the grass to grow before we mow. And so if we are maintaining our tall fescue lawn at 3 inches, we can actually allow to grow to a maximum of 4.5 before we mow. And that will allow us to maintain compliance with that 1/3 rule, where we're not removing more than 1/3 of the plant in a mowing. Certainly, if we want to mow before it reaches 4.5 inches, we can. There's nothing negative about that. If you want to mow your lawn 3 times a week, you're certainly able to do that, but there's not a need to it. As long as we don't let it exceed that 4.5 inches, we're still not doing too much of a shock to that plant. And a big reason we want to talk about this long on mowing height is when we do mow too low, we can actually damage the crown of the grass. So these grasses more or less kind of grow in small clumps, and you can see it depicted there. And the crown is just kind of that area where the shoot growth meets the root growth. And so we really don't want to see that area be exposed to the blazing direct sun in summer. Again, these are cool season grasses. And so what happens when we let there have a lot of growth, or if we're cutting too low all the time, we're exposing that crown to the sun. And too much and too hot is damaging to these crowns. And so we don't want to damage those, because this is where the grass is growing from. This is where they're producing tillers, which are basically offshoots that help the lawn fill in. It'll look more full because it is more full. There's more plants there. So we want to keep our crowns as healthy as possible. So mowing height is very important. I want to talk some about weed control. A lot of the calls I get into the office about lawns are actually about weed control. A big thing about weed control is knowing what the actual weed is. It's actually absolutely critical for effective control. So there are different life cycles of weeds out there. We have winter annuals that right now on our lawns are very noticeable, but unfortunately, it's not the time to control those. We've missed that window, and I will mention that in a moment. The other thing the other categories we see are annual broadleaf as well as grassy weeds. So yes, we have a grass lawn, but there's also weeds that are grasses that we don't want growing there. And then of course there's perennials as well. Some of those are broadleaf perennials, some are grasses. UT has a very good program for your phone. You can look it up online too. So I did put that address there on your screen as well, but it's the mobile weed manual. You can download that. I know for iPhones for a fact, and I believe it also for the Android platform, but it has a good, what it is it gives you both ID of weeds, also herbicide recommendations. However, a very big caveat on the herbicide recommendations: this was created for turf grass professionals. So the actual products listed on the herbicide side are those for the professional side. So many of them are not ones that homeowners are going to have access to. You're not going to be able to purchase those. The active ingredients may be available in a different product, but the name brand product that may be listed there is not necessarily going to be something you can purchase, or it may only be available in gallon-sized containers, and it's just a few ounces per acre. And so, it's a several $100 product, so it's not feasible. So it's not necessarily the best one to get the recommendation for weed control, but certainly ID, they have it sorted based on, is it a broadleaf plant? Is it a grassy plant? And certainly it's pretty user-friendly. So I think they did some good work with that. So check that out if you'd like to. But I mentioned this a moment ago, our winter annual broadleaf weeds, and this is just a sampling. There's a ton of different ones out there, some of them more minor, some of them more major. But if you see those purple flowers blooming in fields and lawns, those are either henbit or purple dead nettle, kind of pretty, but they're not our lawn. And so if we want a grassy lawn, we probably don't want to see those there. Chickweed is one with its little white flowers, very common, we see it. And then the corn speedwell with a blue flower, we can also see it pretty frequently in our region. The thing about these is I think we notice them when they're blooming, and they're blooming in spring. And so while we would like to control them and prevent them from going to seed, the problem is we have a large plant typically, because often these are blooming even before we start mowing our lawns. And larger plants are harder to kill with herbicides than smaller plants. And so generally, yes, you can apply control for these in the spring. It doesn't do a whole lot. It's not going to change much. And so because of that, we really want to focus on late summer and early fall for control, because these actually germinate in late summer. So, you know, around the same time period that we may be sowing a replacement lawn, you know, so in September into early fall, these are germinating and growing. And so that's when they're most vulnerable, when we can have the greatest activity. So because these are growing from seed, we can use pre-emergent herbicides, which interrupt or prevent the germination of seed, or we can use post-emergent herbicides, which are just saying that these are herbicides that we have applied to plants, in this case in the fall, when they're actively growing. And so either one is acceptable depending on how you want to manage your lawn. And certainly this is what will prevent these showing up the next spring, is actually doing that control in late summer and early fall. Grassy weeds, there's a whole host of grassy weeds out there we could mention. I thought I'd do two that are a little bit different from each other. Crabgrass, this happens to be a large crabgrass. There's hairy crabgrass, there's smooth crabgrass, but crabgrass is growing from seed. And so it's one that when we see the yellow forsythia bushes blooming about, you know, early to mid March, is a good time to put down crabgrass preventer. It's a pre-emergent herbicide that actually prevents the germination of crabgrass. And if we're doing that, we'd want to apply it again about 8 weeks later, or 6 to 8 weeks, just to make sure we have longer control over it. Bermuda grass, on the other hand, is one that is a warm season. It's not really growing from seed. It typically spreads by rhizomes that we see depicted there. Often it's encroaching in from somewhere else into our lawns. It can be a real challenge to control. There are herbicides that will suppress it in fescue lawns. And notice I said suppress and not eradicate. It is a challenge. I have heard some turf professionals say that if you have repeated troubles with Bermuda grass in your lawn, that maybe your lawn telling you it wants to be a Bermuda grass lawn. The challenge or the difference with Bermuda grass and like fescue, a noticeable one for many homeowners, is when Bermuda grass, a warm species, goes dormant in winter, it turns tan. So you don't have green cover on the ground in the winter period. Some people really don't like that, but certainly Bermuda grass lawns are a possibility in our region. So if you are having significant problems with Bermuda grass, sometimes it may be time to wave the white flag and look at converting your lawn to Bermuda grass. Of course, we do have perennial weeds as well. And so some of these can be real challenging for us. So, you know, violets, they're a pretty little flower. But again, if you really want that very nice lawn look, they're going to be something that you want to deal with. And although there's the phrase shrinking violet, if you ever have to actually eradicate these from a lawn, you're going to find out they're not a lightweight at all. They're actually a very difficult weed to control in lawns. One of the reasons is they will make seed on the flowers above ground, but they will also set seed below ground without even pollination happening. So they're a real challenge in the lawn, but they can be dealt with. There are products that will have good control, but it's also going to be something that it's not once and done. And we should say that with weed control. Weed control is not something where we do 1 year of control on the lawn and we never see that weed again. And part of that is when we do have seeds from these in our soil, they don't all germinate at the same time. So with gardeners, there's an old adage that says 1 year of weeds going to seed, then 7 years of weeding. That's probably a gross understatement, because when these weed seeds are dispersed, some will germinate the next year, some the year after that, and so on. And so there have been cases where weed seeds that are known to be decades old will still germinate and do well. And so sometimes whenever we do earth moving or things like that, we suddenly have weeds popping up that we don't see in the area now, but at one time those seeds were deposited. It's called the weed seed bank, and it's in our soil. And so just knowing that, okay, if we eradicate all the living plants now, that doesn't mean there aren't seed there to germinate and come back. Virginia buttonweed is one that we can have very dense mats of this growing. And yes, it's got a nice little white flower. I sometimes find that this is worse in wetter areas. I think that's an advantage it has over our fescue species, that it can tolerate wetness better. And then on the right, we have yellow nutsedge. Looks very grassy, but it's not at all a grass. And so if you were trying to, this goes back somewhat to identification, if you were trying to control this and using products that were selective for grasses, it's not going to be bothered in the least. So ID is important. A distinguishing feature of nutsedge is triangular shaped stems. And there's a couple other sedges or sedge-like plants that have that. But it's a way to identify it. Interesting thing about nutsedge is it will very readily poke through like plastic mulches. So in an agriculture setting, like in commercial vegetables fields and raised beds, you can actually see where it's just poked through plastic and grown. It's a pretty tenacious little plant, and it can be a problem, especially if it gets well established. So the way we approach effective weed control, and really this is kind of looking at weed control from integrated pest management. So IPM, or integrated pest management, is basically just an approach that says we're not going to immediately jump to chemical controls, and we're going to approach things in a wider view to hopefully have the least potential negative impact on the environment possible. And also, even from an economic standpoint, IPM is important for agricultural producers to make sure that the cost of control is actually going to result in a return on that investment in control. So one of the very first things when we're talking about weed control is having healthy grass or a healthy lawn in general. And we do that by all the things we were talking about: fertility at the right time of year, mowing heights, irrigation if we want to do it. We certainly can have successful lawns in our areas without irrigation, but there are times when it is nice to have, particularly if we want to have the most robust lawn as possible, but it's not a have to. Definitely, we need to make sure we make that proper weed identification. We cannot control weeds effectively if we don't know what it is, because we can be wrong on the product, the active ingredient that we're actually choosing. We can also be wrong on the timing. And so we need that proper identification. That's certainly something that our office will assist with. You can send me pictures, you can bring samples by, and if it stumps me, I've got the ability to send that on to other folks. That's one of the strengths of Extension, is it's not just your local agent there that is doing this, but he's supported, or she is supported by a host of specialists behind them that can really lend a helping hand when they're not able to make a diagnosis. And we want to, of course, always make sure we're using herbicides properly, and that is to say we're following the label. The label is the law. That's something you'll hear from Extension folks quite often. And it's simply that what the label allows us to do or disallows us from doing must be followed. And so certainly everything from the rates of the product we're applying to how we're applying it is important. The other thing, and I've said this earlier, Weed control is not just a once and done. It is a multi-year focus. You need to make sure that you're doing practices that are effective, not just 1 year, but several years, because essentially, if there are conditions that allow weeds to really take advantage, they're probably going to, it's not a quick fix. It's going to be something that you're going to want to focus on. And again, maintaining that healthy grass for multiple years is the best way to have long-term control. So as I was putting this talk together, I got to looking and thinking about, what about insect control? Insect control is not something we do a lot in home lawns. And it's just because, given the nature of them, quite often it just isn't a problem. So one thing that does pop to people's mind lots of times with lawns is grub control. And so we do have a good publication on lawn insects and how to control them. So if you're having a specific problem, and certainly there's the odd things that pop up, like fall armyworm this last summer was actually popping up in our region, but that's probably a once in a 20-year happening. Basically, everything just has to line up correctly, that we have large populations of those moths flying into the area. And it was very hit or miss. You would have a lawn that was heavily impacted by those fall armyworm, and a neighbor was completely untouched. So it wasn't widespread necessarily, but it was in our area. But really, you know, the day-to-day sort of thing, we don't see tremendous amount. But with white grubs, and the reason we say white grubs is, one, there's multiple beetle species that actually lay their eggs in the lawn, and those eggs hatch and they're grub, and then they grow and eventually turn into beetles. So it's not just Japanese beetle, although that's a very common one. We're also talking about mastchafer beetles, as well as June beetles. So, you know, it's more than one single beetle species. With those, we actually have some good IPM, some research documented thresholds where we can actually sample and then determine, do we actually need to do some control for grubs? And so there you see, I pulled it out of the publication. Above it is actually threshold targets for white grubs. And so for the mix of potential white grub species, we're talking about, you know, at least 5 to 10 grubs per square foot. So that literally means if you were to basically lift the sod off of a square foot, so 12 inches by 12-inch space, you would need to be able to count 5 to 10 grubs in that area before you should treat. I think very often we will not see that density in our lawns. There could be some issues, and certainly we can sometimes see where we're having a lot of animal activity with lawns and it's causing damage. So we may actually treat for grubs, not so much because the grubs are harming our lawn, but because the animals coming in and digging. Skunks are one that's actually particularly known for digging for grubs and lawns. And certainly we don't necessarily want to attract animals into our lawns and possibly create negative interactions that way. But by and large, grubs are not a huge problem. They can be. We do have some good references, some of those thresholds, and we can check and see. The one perhaps caveat to that is if we are irrigating. When you have irrigated turf during a drought season, that is extremely attractive to Japanese beetle and actually the other beetles as well for egg laying, simply because your soil being irrigated is going to be softer and easier and more successful with egg laying. So in this instances, times where I've seen severe damage from grubs, it's been on irrigated areas and it's been during drought periods. So if you meet those definitions, if you have irrigated lawns and it is a drought period, you may be a little more proactive towards grub control than the average lawn would need to be. Dethatching. So this is something sometimes folks want to do. I think by and large, on the average lawn, it's probably not a problem. So thatch is just basically when we have the lawn producing organic matter faster than it's being decomposed or broken down, and it's a thatch layer that develops. There's actually some good sides to thatch. So thatch is naturally occurring. And so one thing it does, it insulates crowns. Going back to the growing points of those turf grass, it protects them against very rapid shifts or changes in temperature. It literally also has some cushioning effect when we have traffic on that lawn. So it actually protects the crown that way as well. But too much thatch does interfere with the movement of air, water, and fertilizer into the root zone. So it can be a problem. What we have found most often is that excessive thatch accumulates when lawns are over fertilized, over irrigated. So we're really pushing that growth of the grass. And it's typically a greater problem in warm season grasses compared to cool season grasses like fescue. So it doesn't mean that fescue can't have a thatch problem, but it does mean that it's less likely to. And so if you have a lawn where you've really not been fertilizing it or doing anything, it's likely not an issue. Now we can actually measure it. And so on the right, you see the depiction of that thatch layer. That's that brown layer above the soil, but below the green of the turf. And that's the thatch layer. So you can literally get down there and measure it with a ruler or a tape measure. And if that thatch layer is more than 1/2 inch deep, you would want to do dethatching. And so we do want to dethatch while plants are actively growing. So with our fescue lawns, basically September, again, that same time frame as seeding, is going to be the ideal time to do that. We do have a window again in the spring that's possible, but one of the reasons why we may want to do it in September, and this is what a dethatching machine looks like. This is tipped up. So normally all 4 of those rubber wheels you see there would be on the ground. It's tipped up so you can see the cutting blades. They're just blades that basically vertical slashes in the turf. It breaks up that thatch layer. You can sometimes see these machines referred to as vertical mowers for that reason. But again, it just breaks up the thatch. And there are times when we want to do that whenever we're seeding, and we'll mention that in a moment. Another thing we can sometimes do with our lawn is core aeration. Core aeration is where it pops a plug out of the lawn. If you've seen a soil probe, you can see there the tines or the actual part of the aerator that goes into the turf. It looks very much like a soil probe, and it actually has those plugs there that you see being deposited on the surface. What's great about core aeration is we're actually dealing with compaction. So soils can become compacted, and literally a soil that's compacted means that the pore space, so between the different mineral components of the soil, has actually been compressed or removed. Do it enough and you end up with a brick essentially. It's a very dense area, and that's bad because pore space is what allows for air as well as water for roots. And roots need both. Without air, roots will die. Without water, obviously, roots and plants will die. So when we have a lot of traffic, particularly when we have wet conditions, we can create a lot of compaction. So sometimes we can see where, there's kind of trails or tracks through a lawn where it's heavily or often traveled. Those are going to be areas that are probably more likely compacted than the areas that never see traffic. One thing that's good about core aeration as well is we can come through with a top dressing of compost. So literally just spreading compost on the surface, and it will find its way into those holes that we've created. And that's good because compost is rich in organic matter. And organic matter is a great thing to do to your soil. It allows for greater retention of water as well as nutrients. If you have clay soils, one of the best things you can do to a clay soil is have compost or organic matter more specifically incorporated into it. The challenge with the lawn is we're not doing tillage, we're not doing plowing, and so we don't have a lot of opportunity to actually introduce organic matter into the soil. Core aeration or plug aeration followed by top dressing with compost is one way we can do that. So this can be something that's a very big positive for your lawn. So looking back just for a moment at that management calendar for fescues, there again, we see dethatching in March as well as in April as a possibility. We see aeration also the same, but then again, we have those periods in the fall. And on this chart where you see a capital letter, that means it's an ideal time to do it. And so you see both aeration and dethatching are ideal in September, but also can happen into October. But next we do want to talk about seeding. And so seeding, we have a couple periods when we can do it. So essentially, we want to do it in that fall period. So August 15th through September is our preferred time. There are times when September is very hot and dry. And when that happens, pushing into October, I think can be done without negative effect. We don't want to go too late into fall, but certainly I think the first half of October in most seasons will still be good. If we're too late in fall, we don't allow the small plants to grow enough to mature for winter survival. And so that's why we can't wait too late. We also have a period in spring that works. March is possible, but the challenge with spring seedings is that those hot, dry summers can result in very low survival. So typically I encourage folks, if you're going to be seeding in March, you consider how you're going to be irrigating it. Because if we have hot, dry summer, you're probably not going to see a good return on that March seeding. One strategy that is good to do is to do dethatching or core aerification about 2 weeks prior to seeding. It improves the seed to soil contact, which improves germination. And certainly if you've ever seen a slit seeder that's used for overseeding a lawn, that serves the same purpose. It literally cuts slits into the surface of the soil, and that allows seed to have better contact. So particularly with the fall seeding, we can actually kill a lawn that's there with a non-selective herbicide in August. Typically, we would want to do that if less than 50% of that lawn is tall fescue. So if it's in really bad shape. If we have a good base there, more than 50%, we probably just want to do what's called renovation. So we wouldn't use herbicides to kill or burn down that lawn as it's referred to. Starter fertilizers, I think there's a lack of research. So one of the challenges that is put to extension is to always look for research-based information. And I'm not sure that we have good research that says starter fertilizers are absolutely necessity. I just don't think they are, quite honestly. So it may be possible if you want to skip those, it wouldn't be a problem. Certainly if you're in a situation that the ground you're applying a starter fertilizer to would be at a greater incidence for that fertilizer leaving through runoff or leaching. We wouldn't want to use a phosphorus, and I have seen research that shows skipping phosphorus with starter fertilizers does not result in any negative outcomes. So I would say unless we have a soil test telling us we're deficient in phosphorus or potassium, we can probably skip those and just use the seasonal nitrogen recommendation, because again, the same times we're seeding are the same times that we would be applying nitrogen anyway. But certainly if you use a starter fertilizer, it's not a bad thing, but I'm not certain that it's required for success. So with that, we'll take just a moment and pause, and we'll see if there's any questions.